it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Josep Call. Josep is from Barcelona, Spain. He studied as an undergraduate in the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. Then he attended Emory University in Atlanta in the United States as a graduate student, but he obtained a master's degree and a PhD at Emory. And his career has developed in Germany and in the United Kingdom. In fact, he has a dual appointment right now at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, in Leipzig, and in St. Andrews University in the United Kingdom. He's well known by all of you. He has an incredible amount of very good publications in the main journals in the area, in the world, and you will see his work firsthand in this meeting. Josep, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here.
Thank you so much, Germán, for the invitation, also for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. And also want to say buenos días a todos los participantes. Es un gran placer estar aquí. Es mi primera vez en Colombia. Bueno, la segunda. Llegué a Colombia de rebote, pero eso es otra historia. Es mi primera vez en Colombia y estoy encantado de estar aquí con todos ustedes. So, let's see. Okay, so I would like to start with a cartoon. This is a cartoon by Gary Larson, and in this cartoon you see Professor Schnabel's cleaning lady when she mistakes his time machine for a new dryer. Okay, so she touched the wrong button and she ended up, I don't know, 60 million years from now. Why do I show you this cartoon? Because we are interested in reconstructing the evolution of cognition. However, we don't have a time machine. And then what we have to do is we have to use other methods to try to make inferences about how cognition may have evolved. And one of the methods that we use is we use the comparative method. And here you see, we specialize on primate cognition, but in order to get a full picture of cognitive evolution, one cannot just stay with primates. One has to go into other species as well. By using the data from these different species, we try to make inferences about the cognition of different species. And this is one method that we use, but we combine it with two other methods. One is the fossils. We can make some inferences about, based on the cranial capacity or the tools that are discovered, we can make inferences about the cognition that are, in this case, in the human lineage that our ancestors may have had, and also with the genetic information that is derived from modern studies, then we can see what are the phylogenetic relations between the different species. So you have to think about this talk as trying to combine the information from these different sources. Obviously, the comparative method, the comparative data that we and our colleagues collect is going to be the centerpiece. But this centerpiece is going to be flanked by data from the fossil record, and is going to be backgrounded by information about genetics. So we start with the chimpanzee, and this is the outline. So starting from the chimpanzee, from the studies that we do, I told you we specialize on primate cognition, in particular about grade 8 cognition. So what we are going to do is we're going to go from there, and we are going to focus on three different zoological taxa. We're going to look a little bit, this is going to be very tiny, as a way of introduction on some fossils, hominids. Then we're going to talk about also corvids, and finally monkeys will also play an important role in this talk. So the main species that we will talk will be primates, will be corvids, but in between you will see other species that have also been investigated in some of the topics that I will present. And the way we will proceed is, as I said, we will start with the fossil record, and then we will go and we'll start by looking at the sequential tool use. We'll start with tools, planning, and sequential tool use. Then we will move and we will talk about motor inhibition, and social inhibition, and finally, I will finish with mind reading. So the three big topics in this talk, the topics that will produce the data, there it is. The three big topics that will produce most of the data that you will see today is data on planning, data on inhibitory control, and data on mind reading. And at the very end, after we have gone over all these topics, then I will have some slides to try to put it all together and to also point out future directions of how I think we can further our knowledge in the area of reconstructing the evolution of cognition. So let's start with chimpanzees. And one of the issues that has been investigated most intensively for chimpanzees is social learning. And in particular, there's the variation that one observes in the wild, in the way they use tools mainly, some authors have used it to argue that there are cultures among chimpanzees. This is a paper by Andy Whiting and colleagues, and what you have there is some different populations of chimpanzees. These represent each a different population in Africa, indicated there, and then you can see the variability that exists on these different species in the way they use tools. There are other things besides tools, but it's mostly about tools. Now, why would this be interesting? It's because tools have played an important role in the evolution of humans. Tools, paleoanthropologists always use the fossil record and the tools that they find in their sites to make inferences about how our own species has evolved. So there. Okay, so different types of tools that the chimpanzees use. And so this is some of the tools that our ancestors used about 2 million years ago. Homo habilis may be a potential user of these tools, and these tools were used to scrape food from carcasses. So you can see here sorry for the guys on the other side because you're not going to see the pointer. But here you can see, in these bones, you can see some cut marks. This is the marks left by the tools that were used to scrape the meat off these carcasses. So this is something that, as I said before, it's played a major role in our thinking about how our ancestors have evolved. Now, one thing that is important about these tools, one of the things that has been postulated is that not only these hominids were using those tools, but they were also producing caches of tools. Caches of tools that some of our colleagues in paleoanthropology have argued are the first indications that these species, these hominids, were preparing these tools to use them at a later time. So, in addition, these tools were found in places that were very far, like 10 kilometers away from the place those tools presumably came from. So they were making these caches, and it's been argued that they were making those caches to be prepared when they encounter carcasses near their settlements. Now, the idea of future planning, of doing something for the consequences that we'll have in the future, not for the consequences that we'll have immediately, is something that has been discussed in the literature in the last few years. And this is Endel Talbing. He is a cognitive psychologist specialized in memory, and Talbing threw a challenge at comparative psychologists. And his challenge, he wanted to know if animals would be able to perform an action with no immediate consequences in the absence of current needs to meet future ones. So this is something, in a paper that he wrote 2005, he argued there's no evidence that animals can do this. Can somebody produce some evidence? So we did a study on tool using on the great apes, and we published this paper in which we were able to document that orangutans and bonobos were capable of selecting a tool and then saving to use it the next day. Okay, so they would select it, and they would not use it during the rest of the day. What they would do is, when now an opportunity came to use it, then they would bring it with them, and then they would use it. So this was the first indication that at least primates would be able to do they would be able to solve this kind of problem. So now, if we look at the species that had been investigated back then, well, we can say that the orangutans were able to do this task, so were bonobos able to do this task. Now there has been some data showing that also chimpanzees can do it. Gorillas we don't know, and we assume that humans can do this. At least Endel Tolving has written extensively about our ability to do this thing. So since then, other papers, this goes this way. Okay, other papers, this was the original paper that we published, and then it's been replicated by 2 other teams of researchers. Then there is data also, the COVID data that has come out of Nikki Clayton's lab is very interesting, where it shows that the scrub jays are caching strategically, so they are making decisions based on the consequences that those decisions will have for tomorrow. Also, there is some data now that the chimpanzees can make tools, not only for a use that for something for later, not just save them, select them and save them, but also there is some evidence. This evidence is weaker, I have to admit, than the evidence on selecting the tools, but there is some evidence suggesting that they may also have some ability to prepare something for something that they need to do later. And finally, there is now data also on apes exchanging objects with humans and saving those objects to exchange them at a later time. And I want to stop in this task to show you in more detail the results that have been found. So in this task, let me explain the setup. The way it goes is the ape, there are 3 phases during the experiment, and then the ape is in a room, and in this room it's got some objects. Okay? So the ape is left there for some time, and after that time, then the ape is moved to a contiguous room. The door is closed, and any object that is left behind, it's cleaned up. So we remove every object that has not been transported. And then after some time, the ape comes back, and then we again close the door, and after that, right. The experimenter comes back, and then it's ready to exchange objects for food. So in order to solve the task, what the ape has to do, it has to select the objects here, transport them to the other room, keep them there, don't lose them, and then when you are brought back, bring the objects back with you. These are just tokens. They are not tools, they are tokens. So bring the objects back with you. If you can do that, then the experimenter will come, and then they will be able to exchange the objects. What we found is we tested the 3 great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans. Okay, and then we had 2 groups. We made 2 groups. There was one group in which there was, as soon as the apes came into this room, the experimenter entered, and then they exchanged. The experimenter was ready to exchange. There was another condition in which, after the ape came back to the room, the experimenter never showed up. So there was no possibility of exchange. We wanted to know if the apes were sensitive to whether the experimenter is going to be there to be able to exchange the objects for food. So we had 2 groups, so we had the 2 conditions, the condition in which they could exchange and the condition where they could not exchange because they were released immediately, and then we had 2 groups and we counterbalanced the order of those 2 conditions. So there, oh, oops. Okay, so this is the data on success. And what you can see here is, so here you have the exchange release group and the release exchange group. I feel bad for you guys because you're not seeing my pointer, so there, you see. Okay, so what you can see is in the exchange group, the orangutans and the bonobos were able to exchange in about between 50 and 70% of the trials. They brought at least one object to exchange. The chimpanzees, surprisingly, if I may say so, they did not do much. Now, when we changed the conditions from exchange to release, the probability, the percent of trials in which they brought an object went down, not surprisingly. Now, in the other group, when we started with the release, so they came back to the room, and then we released them immediately, so they never had any chance to exchange, then they did not bring much. They did not bring many tools. However, as soon as they could exchange, you see that there was an increase. So it seems that the bringing the tools is not something that they simply do because they like carrying the tools around. It is dependent on whether they will have an opportunity to exchange. You can now put monkeys in the picture, and when you put monkeys in the picture, what you see is monkeys basically. In this, we ran 2 studies. The study with monkeys did not have these 2 groups. It had just 1 group, and if you, the data would fall here. So the monkeys, just like the chimpanzees, they did not bring back objects, or they brought back very, very few objects in very few trials. Now, the data of the orangutans and the bonobos fits with the data that I showed you before, but the chimpanzee data does not. It is possible that chimpanzees for some reason would not do that, but this study is a replication of a previous study that had shown the same thing. So for some reason, and this is still something that puzzles me, is chimpanzees, they did not bring tools, they did not bring objects to exchange, but they would be able to bring objects to use, to bring tools to use them and get some reward. Right, okay, so now if we extend the evolutionary tree with the data, we see that the orangutans and the bonobos are still the ones that are performing the best. Regardless of the task that you try, they do well. The chimpanzees, the object exchange task, they don't do so well. And the monkeys that we did not try with the tool using task, but with the object exchange task, they did not do well at all. Now, as I said before, I mean, the future planning is something that has also been described in ScrapJS. And this is good because this data now is going to allow us, they can catch things for the consequences that we'll have later. And they are sensitive to the type of contingencies that they will have the next day, for instance. And this is good because now we can make a transition. Another thing that corvids have received a lot of attention is their abilities to innovate and their abilities to use tools, in particular New Caledonian crows that you see depicted here. New Caledonian crows that depicted there, but also some other crows. For instance, the rooks. Rooks have been shown to use tools in the laboratory in quite innovative ways. So now, if you think about the outline I showed you before, that pyramid that we had with the 3 things, now we are at the very top of the pyramid, and so we are going to have some data on corvids as well. So the corvids use tools. This is something that traditionally has been seen in chimpanzees, and now we have the New Caledonian crows, that some of the things that they are doing are very similar to the things that had been described before for chimpanzees. This is interesting. Nikki Clayton and Nathan Emery had argued that this may be a case of convergent evolution, which from the point of view of comparative psychology, I think is a very, very exciting development. So some of the things that this has been shown that the corvids can do is, for instance, sequential tool use. When they are presented with a problem like this, where they need to get a worm, but the problem is this stone is too big and it does not fit through this tube. What they do is they can go and put this stone into this tube, so it releases a smaller stone, and now the smaller stone they can use to produce a worm. So they can use a tool to get another tool, and with that other tool get the reward. This is something that has also been seen. So this study is I'm thinking about the name of Spanish now, but this is done with rooks, as I said before, and this one is done with New Caledonian crows, the idea being the same. They use one tool to get another tool, to get another tool, to get another tool, and to get the reward. Now, we were interested now in comparing the apes, how would the apes would do in a task in which they had to plan a sequence of steps in order to solve the task. And this is what we presented them. We presented them with a situation in which there were 3 platforms, and in one platform we would put food, and we would put food here at different distances. Okay, the food sometimes was very close, sometimes was very far. Then there was a second platform in which we will always put a short tool, and this short tool was always within reach. And finally, there was a third platform in which we would put tools of different lengths. So the first, there. So this is the first platform. There is the short tool, 20 centimeters long, and they always had access to that. And then what they had to do is we had two conditions. In one condition, in what we call the sequential trials, they would have a set of tools of different lengths, with the tool that is the longest is the one that is farthest away. I told you before that in this platform, the tool was at different distances. So sometimes was close, sometimes was far. So now you have to decide what type of tool I need in order to get the food. So they had to decide the tool that I have in my hand now, this one, is that enough to get the food, or do I need to get another one? One thing that is important here is when the ape had the short tool and went here to fish for these other tools, it could not see the distance at the food. The food was back there, it's like 3 meters away, and at the moment I was seeing the tools, could not see where the food was. So it had to remember at what distance the food was in order to select the appropriate tool. Obviously, here, if the tool can be reached with a tool of 30 centimeters, you do not want to go and get the 50 centimeter tool. Just get the 30 centimeters is a more optimal response, and then just get this tool and use it. So this was in sequential tools. In control trials, what we had is exactly the same type of tools, but they all were at the same distance. So they could reach, they could come here, and they could select any tool that they wanted. They did not need to fish for these tools sequentially. So these are the results in success on these two conditions. First, these are the control trials. In the control trials, they do very well. I mean, regardless, this is the distance of the food. So what you have to hear is the different distance of the food. So they do very well in control trials. In sequential trials, this is harder. The farther away the food is, the harder the task becomes, and the more mistakes they make, or they stop fishing for tools. So now, one thing that is interesting to see is their tool selectivity. In this data, what you see is that they are taking into account the distance at which the food is on the platform, because you can see that here their preferred tool is 35 centimeters, but you see how it's shifting here. And it's shifting in a way that is related to the distance of the food. When instead of presented with sequential trials, they are presented with control trials, the open bars here, you see that they systematically prefer the longest tool available. So when the longest tool available is within reach, that's the one they will take. But when they have to fish for the longest tool available, they will only fish for that depending on the distance of the food. If the food is far enough, they will do it. If not, they will just settle for one of the shorter tools. Now I'm going to show you some data, another kind of task that we use for planning. This is work that we have done with Christophe Welter. Christophe is here today, so if you have any hard questions on this task, you can ask him. He'll be happy to answer. So this is a task in which we presented the apes a maze. It's a maze, and as you can see here, let me show you. The species that we tested are great apes, including children. And the task is a maze, and it's a vertical maze, and the way it works is as follows. There is a piece of food here, and now you need to get this piece of food here at the very bottom. And here at the very bottom, there is an opening and you can reach it. Now, here, there are different levels, and see these levels. If you push this food here, it's going to fall onto the next level. And now if you push the food here, it's going to fall onto the next level. But now if you push the food here, it's going to be trapped. It's not going to be able to go down. So what we have in this task is 3 levels and different traps that we can put at the different levels. Okay, so this is the structure of the task. So in every trial, you have to decide where are the traps located. Sometimes they can be located here, sometimes they can be located here, sometimes they can be located here. So you have to decide where are the traps located, and then after you have seen where the traps are located, then you need to decide what are the actions that you need to produce, in what direction you have to push the reward in order to get it at the end, at the very bottom. So the key features of the task, I told you the main idea of the task is the key features are the following. First of all, there are multiple configurations. There are multiple configurations because in every trial we can change the position of the traps. So in addition, what we do is after a subject has solved a given configuration, we change it. So we don't let them work on the same configuration over and over after they have succeeded. In addition, in this task, we can manipulate two things. We can manipulate the change of direction. So, for instance, in this case, one possible solution is to move to the right, and to the right. That solution does not have a change of direction. But in some cases, what you need to do is you need to move to the right, and then to the left. Imagine that this trap is not here, but is here. Then that is a trial that involves a change of direction. Why is that important? Because you will see in the results that's going to have an impact on their ability to solve this problem. And the second important aspect is what we call the level of planning, and is at what level are the traps located. If you, for instance, have traps at the first level, you don't have to plan anything. You simply see that there is a trap on the right side, so just move to the left. No need to plan, or minimal planning. But what happens when both the right and the left are open? Now you need to consider not only your first move, but what you will need to do afterwards. For the analysis, we use the first trial for each configuration. So we don't let them practice on a given configuration. The data I'm going to show you today is based on first trial data on each configuration. And then we measure two things. We measure success. Did they succeed on that particular configuration? And second is, did they make the correct decision on the first move? That means, in this case, moving there, that's the wrong decision. Why? Because after you make that move, you are lost. You are not going to be able to get that food. The correct solution, the correct first move would be to move to the right. Okay? So this is the data for level of planning. So when the traps are at the level 0, 1, or 2, and what you can see here is we have the data for the non-human apes and for 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And one thing that you see is that for the apes, the level of planning does not matter so much. They are all performing more or less at the same level. For the children, the level of planning has a major impact. Yeah, thank you. That's very nice that you're doing this. I thought I was doing it for a moment, but I thought that cannot be. Okay, for the level of planning, you see that 4-year-olds, when this level of planning 0, they do much better, and there is a sharp decrease in performance. The same is true for 5-year-olds. 5-year-olds, in general, they do a little bit better than 4-year-olds, but here, the key message here is that at the level of planning 0, the children are doing better, but when we get to level of planning 2, there are no differences between the apes and the children. With regard to motor control, we see a completely different pattern. So this now, remember, this is whether they have to change the path of motion to solve the task. The apes, there is a massive effect of that. If they have to change from left to right, the performance is much worse than if they can always go to one side. For the children, this is absolutely no problem. Whether they have to change paths, the direction of the movement or not, for them is not a problem. One thing that was very intriguing what we saw, what the data that you saw here is this maze is solved by using your finger. Okay, there's no tools involved. So they just use their finger. Now what we wanted to know is what would happen if now we introduce a tool. How would they perform? And here what you have is two groups of subjects. One group of subjects, we tested them with the finger. They didn't have to use a tool. And here another group of subjects, now they had to use a tool to move the reward. The task is exactly the same. The only difference is you use a finger or you move a tool, or you use a tool. And here, the variable that we have here is change of direction. When there is change of direction, recall that I told you this was hard for the apes. Whether you use a tool or not, it makes no major difference. It's still a hard task, whether you have to use a tool or not. However, when you do not have to change direction, using a tool imposes a cost, a significant cost. And this is interesting because some of the tasks that have been used to assess causal knowledge in primates and other species are based on using a tool to solve a problem and to avoid a trap. And this is interesting because most of these studies have focused on the trap, but the data that I show you suggests that using a tool is not a trivial thing. So if this task is presented in a toolless version, subjects do much better when they have to avoid traps. So this is, I think, an important lesson for us, because in this task, when the tool is imposing an important cost on their performance. And with that, one of the costs that is imposing, also what I told you about the change of direction, it has to do with inhibition. So now we're going to move on to inhibition. Now we are going to focus mostly on primates. We're going to focus on apes, and we're going to focus on monkeys. And we are going to look at what could be some socio-ecological determinants of the behavior that we observe, in particular inhibitory control in primates. And for this study, what we are going to do is we're going to focus on, in terms of socio-ecological variables, we're going to focus on one variable about social organization, and this variable is whether the species in question are showing, to what level they have what is called fission-fusion dynamics. Of these 7 primate species, gorillas, long-tailed macaques, and capuchins, they show a low level of fission-fusion dynamics. And these other species, orangutans, bonobos, chimpanzees, and spider monkeys, they are considered to have high fission-fusion dynamics. Now, let me tell you very briefly what fission-fusion dynamics is for those of you who do not know. Fission-fusion dynamics is there. It's a characteristic that reflects a degree of variation in spatial cohesion and individual membership in subgroups. There are some species that they forage together during the whole day, but there are some other species that disperse, and they break into smaller parties, and those parties do not come back at the end of the day and sleep together. So the ones that have high fission-fusion dynamics are those that split into smaller parties for foraging, and the membership of those parties changes from day to day. You could think about it in this way. Their groups are, in terms of group membership, are less stable over time and space. Now, it's been postulated that the spatial and temporal dispersion creates some challenges that the species have to be able to solve. And these challenges demand cognitive flexibility, behavioral flexibility. My colleague Filippo Aureli postulated that there might be an enhancement of cognitive abilities. Some of the cognitive abilities are listed here: certain memory skills, inferential skills, planning abilities, and inhibitory control in those species that have to deal with this dispersion in terms of time and space. Okay, so today we are going to focus on inhibitory control. The species that we studied, those 7, and here you have the sample sizes and their phylogenetic relationships. And we used not one task, but a battery of tasks. A battery of tasks that have been suggested to measure inhibitory control. And for instance, here you have one such task, and here what you have is you have this box, and what you have is a banana that is behind a transparent door. This is a swing door. Now what you can do is you can try to reach directly for it, but if you do that, then you're going to lose the banana because the door is going to push it away. You are not going to get it. The way to solve that task is what's depicted here. You have to inhibit the natural tendency of reaching directly for the food, and then you have to reach around. You need to reach from behind and capture the food from behind. Okay, so that's how you solve that task. There are other tasks that the inhibitory control is about time. It's not about the motor ability, but it's about a temporal dimension. The results are these, and don't worry, you don't need to memorize those results. I'm just simply showing you so you see the different species for each of those tasks. It got some scores, and then we transform them into ranks. And with the ranks, then I show you a graph that is more readable. Here, if you have low, that means you are doing well because it's ranked. Number 1 is the lowest, and as you can see, we see that bonobos, orangutans, chimpanzees, spider monkeys, then gorillas, capuchins, and macaques. That's the order, okay? One thing that is interesting in this graph is that we see that one of the monkey species, the spider monkeys, have split the great apes. The gorillas are scoring less, they are worse at inhibitory control measured by the task that I show you than spider monkeys. So here we don't have any distinction between apes and monkeys. In fact, if you take this data and then you do a cluster analysis and you ask for a 2-cluster solution, this is what you get. You get one cluster that has orangutans, chimpanzees and bonobos, no surprises there, but in this cluster you also have spider monkeys. And look that the distance between spider monkeys and bonobos is very close in terms of the scores that they are getting in that task. So the other cluster has capuchin monkeys, long-tailed macaques, and gorillas. So the gorillas belong to the cluster with the 2 other monkeys. Now, this is not to say that gorillas are exactly as these other monkeys, because as you can see in the solution, they enter kind of late in the analysis. These 2 are similar, these 2 are similar, these 3 are similar, but gorillas are entering, as I say, late. But if you have to put gorillas in one or the other, gorillas belong here, not here. So it seems that socioecology, at least measured in terms of fission-fusion dynamics, may have some explanatory power, but this is a correlational analysis. Now, one other thing that we did is we also measure social tolerance. Social tolerance measured in a way, a very simple way, where you simply put, it's measured as co-drinking. So you put 2 drinkers in spatial proximity and you see whether individuals will drink together, and there was no conflict. And here we measure social tolerance, as you can see here, and in this case, the higher your score, the more tolerant you are. And this is the results. And now if you take this data done independently of that other study, and now you correlate with the data on inhibitory control, the inhibitory score, you see you have a very nice correlation. This is not necessarily about fission-fusion. This is another variable that could explain the relation that we saw before. With this, I want to say that I think it is important that we look for socio-ecological determinants, but at the moment, we still, the data that we have is not very powerful to do those kinds of analysis. So here you have the pictures of the different species. And now I'm going to move on to social inhibition before we get into mind reading. The data that I show you until now on inhibition is about physical cognition tasks. There is no social component. Now, what happens when you present them, you present species with a social inhibition task? The reason why there are more tasks on inhibitory control that are physical cognition tasks is because it's much easier to design them and to implement them. It is relatively difficult to do tasks on social inhibition. And I'm going to show you one. In this task, what you have is you have 2 monkeys, and you have one subordinate monkey and a dominant monkey. And they're going to be competing for food. The food is locked in this door, and in this box, sorry, and it's there. And there are 2 conditions. There is one condition in which the box is opaque, and another condition where the box is clear. The dominant monkey does not know how to open the box. The subordinate monkey knows how to open it. Why? Because we trained the monkey to open the box before. So in this case, in both cases, the subordinate monkey knows how to open the door, and in this case, the dominant sees that there is a piece of food inside. Now, What the subordinate monkey should do, if it wants to get the food, and it wants to get the food, trust me, is if the dominant is around, don't try to get it, because the dominant is going to take it from you. So in that sense, we can measure some social inhibition. Are they capable of waiting? And if they are, how are they doing this? So we tested these three species: spider monkeys, capuchin monkeys, and long-tailed macaques, and this is what we found. First, the data on the clear box. Two things are an interesting thing in this graph. I mean, the first thing to see is that here you have the different categories. This is when they open the box, and this is here they don't even try to open the box. What you see is that long-tailed macaques, they have a much higher proportion of not even trying to open the box, regardless of whether the dominant is close or far. So the strategy that the long-tailed macaques take in this situation is they freeze. They don't do anything. In contrast, the other two species, capuchin monkeys and spider monkeys, you see they have a smaller percentage of no attempts. They try to open the box, but interestingly enough, the way they do it and their success also varies. Spider monkeys do it mostly when they are alone, and as you can see, the black bars means that the subordinate got the food, so the spider monkeys are quite successful. There's only a small percentage of trials in which here nobody will get the food, so spider monkeys are scoring in this task quite well. What the capuchin monkeys do, the capuchin monkeys, as you can see, most of their attempts are when they are together with other individuals, and they will lose the food most of the time, or they would not get it. So even though they have the same percent of no attempts as the long-tailed macaques, the way they distribute their attempts is also different. The data on the opaque box is the same, so it's very, very similar. So I won't go into it, but you can see the patterns with the clear box or the opaque box are the same. And from here, we're going to move into mind reading. We're going to move into mind reading because now we've gotten into the area of competition, and now the individuals are going to compete for food. And here what you have is, this is a task we did some years ago, and you have, you have a subordinate chimpanzee and a dominant chimpanzee, and there are two pieces of food. This is one of the setups. We use several others, and now the idea is that here the dominant chimpanzee can only see this piece of food because this one is behind a barrier and it cannot see it. But the subordinate can see both because of the position where she is at. Another question is, when subordinates are presented with this situation, do they preferentially target the food that only they can see and not the subordinate and not the dominant? I insist that here both pieces of food are visible for the subordinate, so it's not that one is more visible than the other. So when you present this task on different variations to chimpanzees, the results that we got, so I'll show you a video first. Could you please click? Hello? Hi. Could you please click on the video? So here what you're going to see is, here is the subordinate. And so now we're going to close the door. The dominant is here. You cannot see the dominant. Now subordinate is going to come out, and it's got to decide where to takes that one, and now the dominant goes to the other one. One thing that I couldn't stop the video here, but one thing that we do is, you saw that we open the door first for the subordinate, and then only after the subordinate has entered the room, then we start to open the door for the dominant. Okay, and then the rest is what you saw. So this is just a video. So now when you look at the data, this is the data that we got, is subordinates preferentially targeted the hidden piece, the piece that the dominant could not see. Now, this finding alone tells us not much about the representation that they are using, what kind of cue the subject is using to solve this task. So there are a number of cues, behavioral rules or cues, that have been proposed to explain results like this, and here you have them listed, and in red you have the studies that have refuted them. So some of these hypotheses have been proposed, all of them have been proposed, and now when we try to see whether those hypotheses could explain the result, I mean, they could not. Now, I will not go over each single one of these, but I'm going to show you two strategies that we have used to try to figure out what kind of information, what kind of representation is controlling the behavior of the subjects. So we have done two things. First, we have tried to, one approach we've taken is controlling cues. Somebody could say of that first experiment that I showed you, well, simply they react to the movements of the dominant, or if they see the dominant look in that direction or that other direction. So first we wanted to know whether they are sensitive to certain kinds of cues, and we presented apes with a situation in which they were confronted with an experimenter, and this experimenter would compete for food with them. This experimenter would try to steal food from them if she could. And what we did is we manipulated a number of variables, and in this case, this picture that you see here corresponds to this data. This is, you see that Alicia is, her frontal area is oriented to this food, to this piece of banana, but she is actually looking, her face is oriented to that other one. So the question is, when a chimpanzee has to decide which one is safer to steal, this one or this one, where will they go? So what you can see here is that here, chimpanzees prefer to come here. Even though her body is oriented to this piece of food, chimpanzees prefer to go for, they come and steal from here, not here. So they are avoiding the face oriented here. This is another condition in which she has completely the back turn or is facing. The results here are stronger, but these results are still significant. We have other variations on this. This is just one example. But I want to move on to the next thing that we have done. This is more recent work. And here what we try to do is we try to eliminate the cues. So here the chimpanzee can see the experimenter, and now the chimpanzee has to decide where to go. And during this particular task, the chimpanzee can see where the experimenter is at every time. But now, in this case, we changed the game. And the way we changed the game was as follows. This is work that we have done with Martin Schmelz, which he's also here today. So don't hide, I can see you. So you can ask him questions too. So the way this task works is, we have two different variations. Let me tell you about one variation, and imagine that the chimpanzee is faced with two boxes, okay, two opaque boxes. And then what we do is, in front of one of the opaque boxes, we put a picture of monkey chow. Okay, so the picture is there, so two identical boxes, but one of the boxes has a picture with monkey chow in the front. And we give the subjects a choice. Subjects prefer to choose that box with the monkey chow. Okay, so they show a preference. Some of the apes show a preference for this box. Okay, good. So that's a pretest. Once we know that they prefer the box with the picture of the monkey chow in front, then we run the experiment. And the experiment is as follows. Now we need to run the video, but could you please also stop? Could you please also stop it? ¿Lo podrías parar cuando yo te diga, por favor? O sea, si lo pudieras clicar ahí, y entonces, eso es. Vale, si yo te digo, lo paras, a ver. Ok, páralo, por favor. Muy bien, perfecto, gracias. So I'm going to show you how a trial works, because I think it's better than I explain. You see the video. So the first thing to notice here is, here you see a barrier. There. We have two chimpanzees, one here and another here. Now the experimenter here is not competing. Simply the experimenter is simply setting up the task. And you have a barrier here, one chimpanzee here, and this chimpanzee here, who's going to be the competitor, cannot see what's going on here. And this chimpanzee cannot see her partner. She knows somebody's in the other side, but it cannot see it during the trial. So now what Martin does is he places two pieces of chow there, and then he's going to do the following. So he's going to put one in a hole, and he's going to cover it with that board, and he's going to put another one, and he's going to cover it there. Okay? And now he's going to put a screen there. You will see why that screen is important. And now he's going to move that there, and he's going to give a choice to the competitor. Can you stop it for a minute, please? ¿Puedes pararlo, por favor? Vale. The competitor is going to choose one of the options. The subject does not see what option the competitor has chosen. And now Martin is going to give a piece of fruit to the competitor, and now he's going to slide this thing back to the subject. Adelante, por favor. Now, one of the pieces is gone, but because of this barrier, this individual does not know. And now she has to choose which one is left, and she chooses that one. Okay? You can do exactly the same thing with the example of the boxes that I told you before. And when you do that, this is what you find. Before you look at the results, let me tell you two factors that we manipulated. One factor is whether the subject chooses first or the subject chooses second. The video that you saw was the subject choosing second. Okay? And the second thing that we manipulated is whether there is a competitor or not. In the social condition, there is a competitor. In the non-social condition, there is no competitor. Okay? So what we see here is when the subject is choosing first, there is no difference between these two conditions. Okay? Also, these conditions, sorry, you cannot see it here. This is the non-social condition. So when there is nobody on the other side, they respond the same. When there is somebody on the other side and they are competing with that someone, if the subject chooses first, they respond very similar to when nobody is on the other side. But if they are choosing second, when there is a competitor, what they are doing is they are changing their choice. Now here, even though they showed no strong preference for one or the other, now when the other subject has chosen, now what they do is they are less likely to choose the option that the other has chosen. And I repeat, they never saw what the other one chose. They never saw even the other playing the game with other individuals. Okay, so, right. This basic task has also been tried with other species. For instance, it's been tried with goats, it's been tried with capuchin monkeys, rhesus macaques, dogs, and ravens. And the results show that there are some animals that do better than the others. So these species, there is a difference in the responses that you get on these species compared to the responses that you get with these. Now, compared to the work on chimpanzees, we know much less about how these species respond because less experiments have been done. We have not been able to pin down as precisely as we have with chimpanzees to know what kind of information they may be using. For instance, there is no data on the last experiment I'll show you of choosing in private. There is no data on any of these two species. So that's, yeah, okay. There are some differences in mind reading abilities across different species, but also you could look at the apes and then you can use some data on, for instance, case following and perspective taking, and there you also see some differences. You see that bonobos are doing better than orangutans, for instance. And this is not one single study, but there are at least 3 studies pointing in that direction. Each study individually is not extremely strong, but when you put them all together, they give you a very consistent picture. So there is some basic skills that all of them share, but there is also some of the, in the harder versions of each of those tasks, we start to see some differences. I have these studies for 2 reasons. One reason is because don't think that we always find differences between the great apes, because when we test other things like, say, spatial tasks, we don't see big differences, but we see differences with humans, for instance. The way they do frames of reference, for instance, the cues or the dimensions that they are using to solve spatial problems differ between the great apes, the non-human great apes, and humans. And the second reason I have this is because there is one area that I will not talk about here, but is this, that of course, at some point during evolution, there was some changes. And for instance, we have never seen apes being able to do this. So this is our human ancestors have already reached a level of symbolic sophistication that is something that we do not see in the great apes. Okay, with that, I would like to finish with 3 slides. So we're almost done. So the first one is, I would like to summarize what we have seen of the 3 cognitive abilities. I will start with planning. So we have seen data on corvids and primates, and I think something that is important to realize is that this planning has different varieties. There is a planning of the sequential tool use that we saw, then there is the planning of the anticipation with the mazes, and there is some planning of, we could call it foresight. These are labels. If you don't like those labels, we can change them. But I think it's important that we see that even though all those tasks are used to study planning, I think they are tapping on different aspects of planning. One thing that is important, before I go here. Yeah. One thing that is important on this task is to investigate more about the temporal dimension. How long can they remember these things? Because in most of these tasks, except for the future planning, we are talking about something that happens in a very short period of time. So, but I think this is something that for future research is important that we do. For inhibition, mostly data on monkeys and apes. And the varieties, you saw inhibition in terms of motor inhibition, social inhibition, and also temporal inhibition. And here we have started to explore the socio-ecological determinants. This is still the very, very beginning, but I think this is something that should continue. In mind reading, you saw data on corvids and primates and the varieties. I think it's important to distinguish between things like seeing, knowledge, and beliefs. When you look at the data here, for instance, there is some, I think, good data on seeing and knowing, but in terms of false belief attribution, for instance, this is something that there is no good evidence showing that non-human animals are capable of solving the tasks that require false belief attribution. And I think it's important in mind reading to distinguish between the processes that create the representations and the representations themselves. And these 2 things, I think, they've been conflated in the past. If you want to know more, please ask me during the questions. I'll be happy to answer. So the title of the talk was Reconstructing the Evolution of Cognition. So I think 3 avenues for reconstructing this cognition, and I hope that I've been able to show you some of these. Common descent is one. For instance, the great apes, we saw that they have similar abilities in terms of foresight and tool use. For convergent evolution, I think we have very nice, interesting parallels between the perspective taking of corvids and apes. As I say, multiple lines of evidence, but I repeat, I mean, we know more about apes simply because we work more with them. And in particular about chimpanzees. And finally, there are derived traits, not just in humans, but I use the example of the cave paintings just to indicate that there is some aspects that this is something that has evolved quite recently, I would say, in our human lineage. And finally, the problems and solutions. I think for the reconstructing, this is the slide of future directions. For reconstructing the evolution of cognition, I think, in terms of a species, I think we need more data on outgroups with which to compare. And also, for instance, in the case of the corvids are a very, very large group. I think we would need more data on intra-corvid variation, because I think that would give very, very interesting data. In addition, we obviously need to test additional species. And in terms of data, the data that we have is what we call low resolution. Some of the theories that have been proposed of cognitive evolution are based on anatomical data, the size of an area in the brain. But these are not functional data. These are not data about behavior. These are not data about cognition. We need to get those data if we are able to hope to have good inferences about the cognition. What I hope that what you saw today is you can take that as a start, but it's obviously we need much more in this area. And then we need to focus on the precise mechanisms, because solving a task doesn't mean that every species is doing it the same way. And also, I think the best way to do this is to use test batteries. And finally, I want to finish my collaborators. Here you have Christoph Welter and Martin Schmelz. I put their pictures there because then you can identify them and you know they're the people you need to ask the questions. And so Christophe and others have worked on the area of planning. Federica Amici and others, this is not Federica Amici, by the way, this is Filippo Aureli, but I didn't have a picture of Federica, so I put Filippo. I hope she won't mind. And so we have worked with them on the inhibition data that I show you, and these are the team of people that have been working on the data on mind reading. So thank you very much. Questions?
That was a really lovely talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I suspect you may have been alluding to this.
I suspect you may have been alluding to this in your comments towards the end of your talk, but with a lot of this sort of work, one of the big confounds is the rate at which it takes the animals to acquire these tasks before you do the testing. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit more broadly about the process of learning the task, perhaps the point that the animals might just be learning to form a simple discriminant.
Some of the tasks that you saw, many of the tasks that you saw, it's the spontaneous performance. There is no training. So, for instance, the task with the chimpanzees. The task of the
It's me. The task of the chimpanzees competing with each other. This is something that is place them in that situation, and they do that spontaneously.
You can also, because we give them multiple trials, you can see whether they change over time. Most of the time they don't. What they're doing on the first session is the same thing they've done throughout. So whenever we can, we try to test things that are spontaneously, and then to see how they will respond to these different tasks. Sometimes we need to train them, and when we do that, then we would have transfer tests to see how they, whether what they have shown during training now they can extrapolate to the transfer test. Yeah. So it's not me, it's the microphone.
You have to turn it off so the one works. Out if it helps. Yeah, the microphone is on again. So thank you for the talk. Maybe this is a stupid question, but again, like about the confounds, you showed this mind-reading tasks, specifically the one on the video. And how do you control for the possibility that they might be picking the correct side with the sense of smell or so on?
Okay, the sense of smell, there are other studies that show that when you put a piece of food under a bucket or a cup or the boxes that you saw, they cannot pick above chance. I mean, the task that you saw on the video with the thing, you give them a choice to say if you had 2 holes and you put food in both holes and you cover it and you give them a choice, they are completely clueless about where the food is. Food in one hole only, sorry. Yeah, so a smell cannot explain these results. Yeah.
Read minds, to have a look of the mind of the other subject. They are not mind readers, as I understood. So how do you conceptualize that behavior of seeing the other subject, and if they not read minds, how do you conceptualize that behavior?
No, I don't need to see they don't read minds. I mean, I think that they are making inferences about what other individuals can see, about what other individuals have seen in the past. What we have found no evidence of is attributing false beliefs to others. So I think that in mind reading, I think it's important to distinguish between what aspect of mind reading one is focusing on. One thing that we still don't know is how they arrive to to be able to infer what others can or cannot see. For instance, it could be an associative process, it could be an inferential process, or it could be a simulation process based on their own experience. At the moment, I think the jury is still out to answer that question.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. The first one is if you see any differences in the behavior between sexes when it comes to mind reading. And the second question is if anything has been done in terms of cooperation, focusing in game theory, precisely if they cooperate, they will get a better award.
In terms of sex differences, the sample sizes that we have are not great to be able to detect differences. However, there are some studies with higher sample size, I'm thinking about one in particular, where female bonobos were better than male bonobos. This is one study, so it's hard to say this is something that you can generalize to other species or to other tasks. Cooperation and game theory, yes. In fact, this is now a very hot topic in the field, and people are looking at how they respond when they are paired with another competitor or cooperator in these kinds of games. People have looked at stuck hunt games. Some of my colleagues in Leipzig have done that. We are looking at the prisoner's dilemma, and we are also looking at the chicken game. And what we find is that this is still very preliminary, okay? So I can tell you the preliminary results, but we still do not know what is under those results. What we find is that some pairs play the prisoner's dilemma and they cooperate. Even though defecting would be the strategy that they should follow. The theory says that's where we should follow. Some individuals cooperate. Now, others defect. In the chicken game is actually more reliable in the sense that they are not both defecting. What they are doing is, what's the name? They are using, sometimes one defects, the other cooperates, then the other one cooperates and the other defects. But you rarely get them in defection, because the punishment there is much higher than for the prisoner. So it is an area that is increasing, is expanding. And I think what we need to do now is we have some preliminary data, and now we need to figure out
whether they are taking this as really a cooperation game with a partner, for instance, or whether they are simply responding to the payoffs that they are getting, regardless of who's the cooperator or the competitor. Yeah? Okay. Okay? Great. Thank you.